Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Peppis, filling in for Barbara Altman. Our guest today is Margaret Randall, a feminist poet, writer, photographer, and social activist. Randall lived among the New York's revolutionary abstract expressionists in the 1950s, participated in the Mexican student movement of 1968, lived in Cuba between 1969 and 1980, and in Nicaragua during the first 4 years of the Sandinista government from 1980 to 1984. Upon her return to the U.S. from Nicaragua in 1984, Randall was ordered deported when the government invoked the 1952 McCarran-Walter Immigration and Nationality Act, judging opinions expressed in some of her books to be, quote, against the good order and happiness of the United States. After a 5-year legal battle, she won reinstatement of citizenship in 1989. One of the founding editors of the groundbreaking bilingual literary quarterly El Corno Emplumado, The Plumed Horn, published between 1962 and 1969, Randall has written over 80 books, including To Change the World, My Years in Cuba. Her most recent collection of poetry is titled Ruins. On April 27, 2012, Randall gave a talk titled A Voice for Ben, celebrating the life and mission of Ben Linder, who was murdered in Nicaragua by U.S.-supported Contras in 1987. The Ben Linder Room in the U of O's Student Union was named in his honor. Margaret, thanks for taking the time to talk to us today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Your background is steeped in cultural transformation and activism. Can you tell us how you came to live in Cuba for a decade?
That happened because of the Mexican student movement of '68. I had actually been to Cuba twice before. You mentioned the magazine, El Corno Emplumado, which was a bilingual poetry magazine published by Sergio Mondragon, a Mexican poet, and myself from '61 to '69. And so the magazine, as most publications at that time did, took the side of the students. I was active also, not in any leadership capacity, but just like tens of thousands of other people in defense of the students. And you know, that was the year '68 when all over the world there were student uprisings in Paris and Berkeley and other places. And as a result of that, in Mexico, it was quite a serious movement in the sense that workers also and peasants joined. It was not just a student movement eventually. And the Mexican government of those years put it down very severely. And as a result of the repression that came off of that, I had to flee Mexico with my family. At that time, I had my husband and 4 small children between the ages of 8 and 3 months. And we ended up in Cuba.
What was it like living in Cuba under Castro?
Those were extraordinary years, extraordinarily good years. The Cuban Revolution was 10 years old at that point. Some of the later problems had not set in yet. There was still that sort of effervescence of those early years, and yet it wasn't right at the beginning, so there were, some things were really consolidated. It was a wonderful place to raise children. It was a safe place. It was a beautiful place. It was a warm place in terms of people's warmth and generosity. And I felt very fortunate to be there at that time.
What were some of the strengths of the revolution, in your opinion?
In my opinion, the big strengths of the Cuban Revolution were, first of all, remaining alive in face of the embargo and so forth all these years. And of course, you know, they depended more and more on the Soviets, and then the Soviet Union and the socialist bloc fell apart. And so, you know, just the fact that Cuba has maintained is a big one. Healthcare is very good in Cuba. Education is very good. Both of them are free. The arts are given a lot of attention. Sports, sustainable agriculture. So, you know, there are a lot of things. Internationalism, the internationalist attitude that Cuba has had with other countries, sending doctors and nurses and teachers all over the world. And I would say that the problems, the main problems are excessive bureaucracy and, of course, a lack of personal freedoms, which is painful. And it's hard to balance that, you know, the people's good against personal freedoms. But I think that Cuba could have done a little better in that area.
And what led you to move to Nicaragua in 1980?
I had become very interested in doing oral history with women. I started doing that when I first came to Cuba in '69. I wrote my first book of oral history with Cuban women. And then over the coming years, I had sort of gotten deeper and deeper into that area. And I had met a group of Sandinistas, Nicaraguan Sandinistas in Cuba. There were, of course, Latin Americans from all over the continent there in those years. And I had also was very friendly with Ernesto Cardenal, a Nicaraguan poet who, and Catholic priest who I had actually met in Mexico before going to Cuba. So when the Sandinistas came to power in 1979, Ernesto invited me to Nicaragua to do a book about Nicaraguan women. And that book is called Sandina's Daughters. And it's probably my best known book, I would say, even today. So I went, I did the field work for that book. I came back to Cuba and wrote the book. And Nicaragua fascinated me for a number of reasons. Well, the Nicaraguan Revolution happened 20 years after the Cuban Revolution. So two very important things had happened internationally in those 20 years. One was the liberation theology, the Second Vatican Council, and the other was feminism worldwide. And I think that those two events really affected and made different the Nicaraguan Revolution. It made it a bit more humanitarian. They made it a bit more open. And I was very interested in how those issues would play out. And so at the end of 1980, my kids were growing by that time, and some of them decided to stay behind in Cuba, and some of them came with me to Nicaragua.
So when you went there with that interest, what did you learn when you were there about the impacts that feminism and liberation theology had in that 20-year period in terms of how the Nicaraguan Revolution occurred or its impact in comparison, say, to Cuba?
Liberation theology had a big impact. As you probably know, a number of the leaders of the Nicaraguan Revolution were, in fact, priests, Catholic priests, liberation theology priests. So that one example would be that while Cuba had capital punishment, Nicaragua never did. So there were issues like that were different. Feminism it had a promise of difference, a deep promise of difference, which thrilled people like me, and of course thrilled the Nicaraguan women. And for a while it seemed that the Sandinistas would really honor that and explore that, and maybe do a gender analysis of Nicaraguan society, and use that, factor that into their analysis of society as a whole. It didn't turn out that way. So,
why do you think it didn't? I mean, do you have an analysis of why that promise didn't get realized?
Well, I do have an analysis. I've written books about it. I don't know if I can talk about it in such a brief time. I think to sum it up, it comes down to the problem of power. Do we empower people when we change society, or do we just transfer the power from one group to another? And I think it's very, very difficult in a patriarchal society, generations, centuries, millennia of patriarchy, to break with that. It's complicated, and I think some of the Sandinistas made a goodwill effort, but eventually it just didn't happen.
What made you want to return to the U.S. in 1984?
Well, probably the most unglamorous reason, although probably closest to the truth, is I was just tired. I wanted to come home. I had that sense, that you have in middle age. I was almost 50. I just felt like I needed to come home. My parents were aging. They were really getting on. I wanted to spend some time with them before it was too late. I think my poetry had a great deal to do with it, too. I write in English. the language is very important to me. I needed to be surrounded by my language. Although I speak Spanish fluently, I never was able to write poetry in Spanish. So it was a number of things. You know, the war was raging in Nicaragua by that time, the Contra War. And most of the young Sandinistas were in their late teens and 20s, you know, and here I was, an almost 50-year-old woman, and I really was exhausted. So all of those things contributed in some way to my wanting to come home.
Can you tell us a little bit about your battle for citizenship when you returned?
It was quite a shock. It was, I mean, I grew up, I think, like most people in this country, believing that there's freedom of speech and freedom of dissent and that you can have different opinions and still be a good American. So I found it quite shocking that a 1952 law would be invoked against me. I think that the government probably was unhappy that I lived in places like Cuba and Nicaragua, so it wasn't just my writings. Mm-hmm. Although they did call me into an office with 7 of my books opened on a table, all richly underlined with yellow magic marker, and, you know, asked me what I meant by this opinion or that. And basically the opinions that I had that they didn't like were, you know, my strong stand against the Vietnam War, against the wars at that time in Latin America, U.S. involvement in those wars. So it was shocking and it was difficult, but I also felt strangely privileged, I think, to be able to fight that battle. I had a lot of support, wonderful support from the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York that provided my lawyers, from Penn International and other organizations and many individuals. And so I also felt that I had a sort of an obligation to, since I had so much support and so many people in this country are denied entrance every day because they don't have that support, that it would be important to try to fight the battle, and I was fortunate and won it.
It's been said that you are too much of a feminist for the socialists and too much of a socialist for the feminist. Do you think that's a fair characterization?
Well, I don't know if it is anymore, really, Paul. I think it was at one time. Mm-hmm. I think, you know, one of the big mistakes of my generation, and I certainly include myself in this, among those of us who wanted to change society, whether we were socialists, communists, liberation theologists, anarchists, whatever we were, or without an ist at all, is that, you know, we had these sort of blindered analyses. And so I've always felt that, or I came to feel out of so many errors, that we need to look at other people's analyses and draw what's most useful from all of them. And this sort of correct lineism is dangerous. Mm-hmm. And so there was a time when, you know, if you were a socialist, you thought, well, you might say, oh, feminism is nice and women should be equal, but you didn't really mean it. And certainly if you were a feminist, you had no interest in class struggle or anything like that. So I think that, you know, there was a moment when whoever said that about me was absolutely correct.
Can you tell us who Ben Linder was?
Ben Linder was an extraordinary young man from this area, from Portland. His mother, Elizabeth, still lives in Portland. And he went to Nicaragua like so many young people did in the 80s. I think he went in 83. And I think we overlapped in Nicaragua, although I didn't know Ben, unfortunately. People went to try to do what they could do. You know, teachers went, doctors went, and so forth. And Ben was a mechanical engineer. And he went with the idea, I'm actually not sure if he had this idea before he went or if he developed it there, that it would be wonderful for the people in some of these remote villages to have light. And so he worked on he worked on a design for a small hydroelectric dam that was relatively simple to build. And his goal was to build these dams throughout the northern part of Nicaragua. He started in a place called San Jose del Bocay. And it was while building one of these dams that he was murdered by the Contras.
Can you tell us a little bit about the circumstances of his murder?
He was, from what I understand, he had set out early one morning to the site of the dam, and he was sitting quietly writing in his notebook, waiting for, I guess, some donkeys or horses to carry a load of cement up the mountain to the site of the dam, when a group of Contras, those same men who Ronald Reagan called freedom fighters, spotted him and two other, or three other actually, Nicaraguans who were working with him, and just opened fire on them. And
they were unarmed?
They were armed, but I mean, you know, Ben didn't have his arm at the ready. He had it probably beside him. Everyone was armed in those years in Nicaragua. You couldn't, especially in an area like that. But he never used his arm. He never had an opportunity to, or I don't know if opportunity is the right word there. They threw grenades at them. They shot them. One of the young Nicaraguans was able to escape into the river, threw himself into the river and was able to escape. And the other three, including Ben, were killed, I guess, instantly. In spite of the fact that they died quickly, the Contras went up to Ben and finished him off, and in a particularly sadistic way. And I think it was a message, you know, U.S. Americans don't come to Nicaragua and mess with us. And so he was 27 years old. It's amazing to me to think today that it's been 25 years since his death, almost as long as the amount of time that he lived. And his family is quite extraordinary, and was from the beginning. They almost immediately, I guess, after the shock of losing Ben, launched a huge campaign to raise money to finish that dam and then build the next and the next. And I don't know how many dams they have built over the years, but it's up there in the dozens, maybe even 100, I'm not sure. And so Ben really did bring light to the northern part of Nicaragua.
Are there other aspects of his legacy that you could tell us about?
Well, I'm sure that there's lots, and people who knew him probably could say more than I did. One thing that just fascinates me about Ben's history is that he was a circus clown and a juggler and a unicyclist. And I know there are many children or adults now in Nicaragua who remember as children Ben riding through the streets dressed as a clown on his unicycle and entertaining them. So he was a multifaceted personality and, as I say, an extraordinary young man.
I know that you've recently spent some more time in Cuba.
Yes.
What's changed since you lived there in the 70s?
Oh, a lot has changed. A lot has changed. I was there most recently in January of last year, of 2011. I was invited to judge the Casa de las Americas literary contest, which is one of the big literary contests in the Spanish language. I had actually judged it in 1970 when I lived in Cuba, and the Cubans joked and said they were going to invite me every 41 years. So I don't know who they're going to invite 41 years from now, but Cuba is amazing. You know, it has so many problems today. The poverty is still very present. Corruption is very present, which was not visible when I was there, and that's very sad. There's, you know, hustling again and prostitution and that kind of thing, which is also very sad for someone like myself who lived there when that didn't exist. At the same time, Cuba is a country with an extraordinarily high standard of education. There is no adult, I don't think, in the island who has less than a 9th grade education. And when you compare that with other Latin American countries, that's quite impressive. Health care is still free and still good. although there are, you know, there are shortages of medicines and so forth. Education is still free and still good. And one of the things that I noticed on this last trip was that they were just beginning to sort of repaint some of the really old, broken down buildings, and they were starting with the schools. So that's always heartening. And I think there's an opening up now, and I think that's going to be good. The month that I went, actually, they had just laid off 500,000 state workers. And when you say state worker in Cuba, you mean, you know, everybody is a state worker. So these people were beginning to have their own private businesses, a little cafe, a store, a shop, whatever. And that kind of worried me at the time. It worried me quite a bit because I thought, well, you know, the Cuban bank is not going to be able to extend enough credit to these people. So probably the exile community is going to step in here. And, you know, what's that going to mean exactly? And I was trying to get a picture of how that would be. And I think it's gone quite a bit better than I expected. So the country has changed, you know, like all countries do. But there's a strange thing. I have so many criticisms. I have criticisms for a government that stays in power 50 years. You know, I just don't see how that can be a good thing. But I always come away from Cuba with a tremendous sense of joy and optimism, because what I feel in Cuba, and it would be hard for me to say in such a short interview why this is so exactly, but what I feel is that with the corruption, with the problems, with the mistakes that the Cubans have made, there's this innate desire to create a more just society. And I just don't feel that here on the part of the government. I feel it on the part of people, of course. So it's a complicated situation, but there it is.
In addition to your social and political activism, you're an accomplished poet and photographer. How do you see the relationship between your political activism and your poetry and photography?
You know, I used to think of myself very much as an activist. I guess I would still identify myself as an activist, but as I get older, I realize that my contribution really is in my work. So I'm not doing that much outside activism as I used to. I write all the time, and I do some photography. And I feel that that's where my voice is. That's, for better or for worse, that's where I can make my contribution. I don't know if that's something that happens to all of us as we get older, or maybe we're just a little tired of all the meetings. But so, you know, in the last, I'd say 20 years, I've really concentrated on my work.
I'm sure you know the famous line from the Auden poem, "Poetry makes nothing happen," which most people, I think, misinterpret the meaning of the line in the poem. But clearly, for you, poetry is a medium for political expression, isn't it?
Well, yes and no. I really reject the idea of a political poem. You know, I think that when a poem tries to be political, it usually fails. I think that poets write about what they're most passionate about, as we all do. We teach, we make music, whatever it is we do it best about what we're most passionate about. So if a person is an activist for social justice, either very active or not so active anymore, that's going to come out in your poetry. Your values are going to come out in your poetry. There is no such thing as apolitical anything, really. You know, you're just... So yes, I think that poetry can change the world. I think that somewhat differently from the way I thought it when I was younger. I think that poetry today, I guess I would say that I think that poetry, when it's particularly good, enables us to live experiences that hold a different kind of truth than the truth, in quotation marks, that we're continually being fed in these sound bites and so forth. So I do think that poetry is political in that larger sense, but not in a sort of partisan way.
Are there any particular writing or photography projects that you're working on now?
Yes. Well, I have a sort of ongoing project. One of the things that happened to me a little bit surprisingly when I came back to the United States, once I got finished with the case, my immigration case and so forth, is that I became deeply fascinated by ancient ruins, both where I live in the American Southwest and all over the world, wherever it is that I'm fortunate enough to get to see them. And I'm very interested in, and so I'm interested in rock art, and I photograph those kinds of things incessantly. And it's sort of an ongoing photographic project. My book, Ruins, which is a relatively recent book of poetry, although not my most recent, is a joining of poems that are rooted in ruins, not always descriptive of a particular ruin, and photographs of ruins from all over the world. And I have another book of poems, a little older, Stone's Witness, that has the same kind of relationship between my photos and my poems. So, you know, at the moment I'm working on a new book of essays, which will be out from the University of Nebraska Press in the spring of next year, and a new book of poems, which will be out next year as well, which is going to be called The Rhizome as a Field of Broken Bones. And I travel a lot to give readings, and so I'm always writing something.
Well, I think that's a good place for us to stop our conversation. We look forward to those new projects. Thank you so much for spending the time and talking with us today.
Thank you, Paul. It's been a pleasure.
We've been speaking with Margaret Randall. She's a feminist poet, writer, photographer, and social activist. A prolific writer, her most recent collection of poetry is titled Ruins. On April 27, 2012, Randall gave a talk titled A Voice for Ben, celebrating the life and mission of Ben Linder, who was murdered in Nicaragua by U.S.-supported Contras in 1987. Thanks for watching.